Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about a civilization that I personally enjoy quite a bit, but have had a lot of struggle to make work recently, and I've been very easily countering the civ when my opponent gets it. And it's really a shame because it's a fun and iconic civilization, and one of my favorite YouTubers, Spirit of the Law, is a big fan of the Japanese, and as it turns out, the Japanese at the moment are not the greatest civ ever. In fact, they find themselves near the bottom of the tier list, at least for me personally, with regards to high level 1v1 Arabia play. And the reason for this is mostly to do with infantry play being weak, but also to do with a couple other points that I've kind of figured out about the Japanese over time. Now in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the good parts about Japanese, so it's not going to be a purely Japanese hate video. We're also going to talk about what they're good at, what they excel at, how they win games, etc. But we are going to point out some very obvious flaws and weaknesses with the civ, and we're going to also talk about a kind of secret strategy that I've come up to always beat the Japanese. I seriously haven't lost to the Japanese in like a month and a half on rank ladder, except one game where I disconnected against Viper. Please believe me, it was a disconnect. Please don't check. It was actually a disconnect, but I was losing. But it really, I think I'm like 20-2 against the civ in the last like 2 months of play, and it's with this one secret opening that works very, very perfectly against the Japanese specifically. But to understand why that opening works, we first have to talk about the Japanese in general. So starting off with point number one, the Japanese actually have a good early game. They save a lot of wood on their lumber camps, mining camps, and mills, costing half price. So in the standard game, you're going to make 1 or 2 lumber camps to save around 50 to 100 wood. You're definitely making a mill, and you're probably making a mining camp before castle age, looking at a total saving of 150 to 200 wood comfortably. So if we say 200 wood from dark age till feudal age or till castle age, you're going to save a solid 200 wood. That's fairly decent as an economy bonus. That's rivaling like Dravidians. It's comparable to something like the Khmer, skipping the barracks. You can maybe even rival something like the Malians in the early game. So it's quite a solid economy bonus to save a little bit of wood and put some pressure on your opponent with those extra resources used in other aspects of the game. The only issue though with the Japanese early game is that their options are rather predictable. In theory, they can open whatever they want, because they can open scouts, they can open archers, they can open any kind of infantry play. Since they have the wood savings, they're actually a very flexible early game civ. But the issue with Japanese and what makes them a little bit predictable is that their economy bonus wears out very fast. And this is something you have to understand as a general concept when analyzing civ bonuses. You have to figure out where the bonus is kicking in and where your civilization is the strongest. And with the Japanese, the civilization is the strongest in that specific timing window, from dark age till castle age, as you're making a lot of mining camps and mills and saving the wood. In castle age onwards, think about like a standard castle age boom. You're making town centers, you're making farms, you're making monasteries and other units, you're making siege. You're not making more lumber camps and mining camps until like late game expansion or late castle age expansions at the very least. And even then, you're only saving 50 wood, which is not the biggest of deals in the later stages of the game. So we can all agree that their economy bonus is very much efficient in the early game and pretty negligible as the game goes on. Don't get me wrong, it's still nice to save the 50 wood and, you know, makes the gameplay smooth as you're spamming lumber camps and mining camps and mills and whatnot later on, but it's not the craziest deal compared to something like Slavs farming 15% faster, which at like 80 farms is absolutely ridiculous. So the Japanese are really good in the start and kind of fall off later in terms of their economy bonus, which is exactly what makes them a little bit of a predictable civ. So in theory, they can open anything that they want in the early game, but in practice, you kind of have to deal damage or else you're going to fall behind as the game goes on compared to other civilizations that have bonuses that scale well into the mid and late game. So the Japanese are now in a position where they're flexible, but they have to look for some early pressure, look for some early damage, and this is where they have to lean on some of their other bonuses. And as it turns out, the Japanese do have some other early game bonuses that could come up handy, at least in theory. The infantry attack 33% faster starting in feudal age, so right off the bat, a men-at-arm rush sounds like a fantastic strategy. You can go with, you know, your cheaper mills and lumber camps early, save a little bit of wood, and then you also have faster attacking men-at-arms. And in practice, the men-at-arms are actually insane. Japanese men-at-arms will do incredibly well against scouts and opposing villagers, so they're actually quite hard to deal with. The only problem though is that men-at-arms in general get countered by archers and skirms quite effectively, because archers and skirms move much quicker than men-at-arms do, which is the reason why they're easily able to kite them down. And so the men-at-arms are really only good against someone opening scouts, or if someone, you know, panics and makes mistakes and they can't get their archers out in time. But usually if the guy can just fast up and go archers or skirms, the men-at-arms will kind of just just do nothing. And so the Japanese now have a situation where they're forced to do damage early, or else they fall behind in comparison to other civilizations. But their one strategy that they get a bonus for, the infantry play, it just happens to be one of the easiest to counter in higher level play. And so while a men-at-arms rush can be really scary in mid to low levels because people won't be, countering it as sharp, in higher level play, the Japanese men-at-arms don't really have time to get value and are actually a very predictable strategy. Players against the Japanese will often just open range with a fast feudal age time, and the Japanese won't have a timing window to do damage. This is the exact reason why the Japanese build order that I recommend is a super fast men-at-arms rush, something like an all-in 18 pop men-at-arms rush that looks to beat the meta and beat the fast up archers and try to get your men-at-arms in there as fast as possible. And this build order works really well, although it's very hard to do. But I do have it out there for people to try, and it's kind of my go-to build order if I want to do damage to the Japanese early. It takes a little bit of risk, it's very hard to do, but if it pays off, your men-at-arms can actually have a chance to do damage. Even with this super fast uptime in mind though, archers and skirms will still be a really good counter to the Japanese early game. And there's also one other bonus here that I'm looking at for the Japanese that comes into play in a relatively decent fashion. It's the cavalry archers that get +2 attack versus archer units. This applies to other foot archers or other unique unit archers or other cav archers, but it does not apply to enemy skirmishers, at least not anymore. It got nerfed from its original bonus, which gave the attack against skirmishers, which in my opinion was a very good bonus. This bonus that we're left with is more or less mediocre. And so with this bonus in mind, your cav archers that get full upgrades, by the way, are a very good option. Like, there's nothing wrong with going Japanese cav archers, so all of a sudden I'm feeling rather optimistic about the Japanese. Even if you don't end the game in feudal age or get some advantage, you still have your cav archers that you can lean on. Cav archer meta is quite real at the moment, so that seems pretty good, but it has some downsides. Before I show you guys the downsides of the cav archers though, I want to reveal my secret opening against the Japanese that's really going to tie this video completely together. The secret opening against Japanese is not to go for an archer opening to counter the men-at-arms, because if you do that, they still have a chance to go for their own archer or skirm follow-up, and they can actually pressure you quite hard with the men-at-arms followed by range units with a faster fletching. They save a lot of resources early, so they can somehow, in some cases, overwhelm you if you open archers. But the secret opening that I found works perfectly every time is to open just one archer into full skirms against the Japanese, or in some cases, you can just open full skirms directly. This is super broken in my opinion, because this lets you up really fast since you don't need a mining camp, so you can put all your resources into getting the range down, making the one archer, and then switching into pure skirm. The one archer will be able to kite super easily against the men-at-arms. You can make one spear to keep your enemy scout away, so your one spear cancels out his scout, your archer cancels out or pushes away the few men-at-arms, and if he tries to push past the archer, all you have to do is wall in your resources and just keep them safe while your archer continues getting value. We're really abusing the fact that the archer can move faster than the men-at-arms, so even just one archer can counter 3 men-at-arms. I know it sounds stupid, but that's literally how the game plays out in practice more often than not. And the reason why I put emphasis that this only really applies well in higher level play is because in lower levels, getting that one archer out and using that only one archer to push back men-at-arms is quite a difficult thing to do, because the men-at-arms, if you don't look for a second, will clap that archer. But if you're constantly paying attention, the archer should never even take a hit from the men-at-arms due to the faster movement speed and the extra range to be able to hit and run effectively forever, basically. And so the secret strat to open just one archer into skirmishers makes it so you don't die to the men-at-arms, but then you also never die to the archer follow-up of the Japanese. They can't really kill you because you're on skirmishers countering their archers, and if they do their own skirmishers, well then you're playing skirm versus skirm, which will actually benefit you in the long run, because now your skirmishers will completely take away their cav archer transition in castlage. And this is exactly why the Japanese have so much trouble right now against this strategy. If you just open the one range skirmishers, you are completely safe against their men-at-arms, their archer follow-up, and their cav archer play. And now you might be wondering, okay, so what if you go for the blind skirmisher opening and your opponent just opens scouts? Well, the response will simply be a skirm spear push, and a skirm spear push will put you in a similar position where you're able to pressure the guy going scouts while also staying quite safe at home and just walling up. And this should get you to a position where you're able to fully wall your base, push with skirm spear, and then in castlage you'll have a decent amount of skirmishers to prevent your opponent from going for the cav archer play. And he's going to be unstable, so he could go knights, but if he goes knights, the Japanese knights are not very good, and the Japanese don't scale very well, so you've survived the early game successfully, you've put him on a unit that he doesn't want to necessarily be on, and you've taken away his best options from him. There is only one caveat that you definitely will think of right now. Okay, if I'm going spear skirm in this scenario, what if my opponent goes for a long swordsman transition in castlage? This is indeed dangerous, but the idea here is that the Japanese don't get any longer lasting eco bonuses. So if they go for a long swordsman push, it's going to be a very hard thing for them to get enough farms to sustain 3 to 4 barracks, which is probably what you need to go for an all-in long swordsman push, since the upgrades are quite expensive and producing them is incredibly important. You need to get the numbers up quickly, or else infantry are very easy to deal with. So 3 to 4 barrack transition for the Japanese is not an easy task, and if they do it, it's more or less an all-in push. And if they go for that, unfortunately, that's where the final piece of the puzzle comes through. If you're just on elite skirmisher, your opponent starts making, long swordsman and tries to push you, you can just simply respond with a 2 monastery defensive monk play, and that is where it's completely disastrous for the Japanese. They have no way to deal with monks defensively. Like, monk elite skirm with a few spears pretty much counters their entire toolkit, and this is only if they invest into the longswords, which is a very all-in transition. So if they don't do that, they have just a few knights, maybe light cav. You can easily counter that with your own CA, or just like your own knights or whatnot. You can just boom up. It's not the scariest unit from the Japanese, and if they try to go into their good units like the infantry, you can just checkmate them by going 2 monasteries and just booming up, and they're just stuck playing all-in longswords, which won't really break the monk defense if you have a bit of walls and maybe a couple scorpions on defense as well. So as you can see with this one archer into skirm opening, you're really never dying to anything that the Japanese can do in practice. And this brings me to the last part of the video, because obviously things can happen, the games can stall out. This is a defensive opening, so you're not actually putting pressure on your opponent. So the Japanese player in theory should not actually die to this opening. He shouldn't fall behind. He should just be like in a neutral game state. And this is where the Japanese completely fall apart as a civ as they enter the late game. The Japanese late game is not horrible, don't get me wrong. It's not up there with like the worst late games in the game. However, it is rather lackluster, and it's especially bad when you don't have map control, because number one, you don't have the +4 armor on the light cap, which is, by the way, what makes the CA play for Japanese not the best out there. Their CA themselves are fantastic, but CA usually go hand in hand with Hussar, because the Hussar is really good at raiding, keeping up with the CA in terms of mobility, and they also counter skirms and siege, which is the biggest flaw of cav archers in general. However, due to the lack of armor on the light cav is actually not fulfilling the role that it should for the Japanese late game. So even if you're on CA in Japanese late game, you don't have the best CA compositions in the game. Japanese CA light cav is okay, but it's not fantastic, and it's certainly not on par with some of the other CA civilizations out there. And so besides this composition, you have pretty generic options. You have arbalest or skirmisher fully upgraded, and you have really strong infantry. But the problem is you don't have bomber cannon, which is really the crutch when it comes to those compositions that are like arbalest, Hal, bomber cannon. You have skirm, Hal, bomber cannon. You have champion, skirm, bomber cannon. Without bomber cannon, you just have champion, skirm. And yes, the Japanese treb is fantastic, but I would argue that it does not fulfill the role that the bomber cannon plays. And this is why the Japanese struggle so much against early game skirm play. It forces them into uncomfortable options, stalls out the game, and then going into late game, the Japanese continue to be countered by skirmishers. The civilization never really has a solution to the skirmishers except the militia line or the champion line or samurai. Those are the only two options that they have against skirms, or their own skirms, but their own skirms will die to civs that have bomber cannons. And if they go for the militia line transition or the samurai, those are at the moment weaker units. Even with the introduction of gambesons, they're just not the strongest options to go for. And so while they can be good, usually the civilizations that can counter the Japanese can just go skirms into something like arbalest or a CA to counter the infantry play, and then wrap it up with bomber cannon or hussar to just make the entire Japanese game plan completely fall apart. Before I end this video, I'm going to include a couple things that the Japanese do thrive at, because as I mentioned, the civilization is still playable. It's not like the worst thing ever. It's not like Dravidians. No, I'm kidding. It's not like the worst civilization ever. It's definitely playable, but it definitely just struggles against a certain kind of playstyle. The Japanese, though, in late game, where they thrive is when they have the map control. If you're able to get map control, the bomber cannons really don't matter as much, because then you're just forcing your opponent back into a corner. And then if you can start chaining their Isama towers on the sides, looking for one big ball of arbalest or champions to control the center with some trebs, and then just expand with the towers, maybe a few light cavs on the sides, avoid like huge engagements. I think that's really where the Japanese thrive. Or when you're up against a cav civ and you're able to use the Japanese halbs, those are probably some of the best halbs in the game, and those are the situations where the Japanese can really do well. The samurai transition also comes up really clutch if you have a forward castle and your opponent is only on skirm bomber cannon to counter your arbalest or your CA, and then you can surprise them with a fast samurai transition. They produce quite quickly and they're a very strong unit, so in this scenario the samurai can actually be very strong and hard to deal with. So while the Japanese do get countered by this nice opening of one archer into skirm or pure skirms, I do still feel like if you're a smart Japanese player, you can kind of play around this strategy and you can still take advantage of your bonuses despite your opponent doing his utmost to keep you away from your strong units. Overall, in the case of the Japanese, and really with any other civilization that has most of its benefits like tech tree or bonuses geared towards infantry, they just suffer from infantry being kind of bad in the game at the moment. A lot of these civilizations, Japanese, Goths, Celts, can actually be a lot stronger if infantry was more or less a threat. The fact that one archer can push away 3 men-at-arms is the reason why the Japanese find themselves in a position where their entire early game and their best early game strategy can be so easily neutralized. As for me personally, I feel like the Japanese are a very easy civilization to play against right now, and as soon as I discovered this opening that just kind of counters everything the Japanese can do, I feel really comfortable going up against them. You just open range, and if the guy goes men at arms, you know the strategy. If you go scouts, you can go spear skirm, and you can also go for a straight archer play as well, because at the end of the day, the guy going scouts with the Japanese will have to play scouts into skirms, and those are units that the Japanese don't really scale well. If he goes into knight skirm, the knights for the Japanese aren't too crazy, and you can just play crossbows into something else, crossbows into knights, or whatever your civ is good at. And so the Japanese don't really thrive against straight archer play either. So this idea that opening range against Japanese and countering every single one of their options is why the civilization is weak, and why I feel like it's just really easy to play against and kind of hard to make work at the highest level of play at the moment. Hope this video was insightful for you guys, and please by all means do not be discouraged to play Japanese at most elo levels. If you're a beginner player and you enjoy playing the Japanese, my advice is just to continue playing with them. Even in mid levels, a lot of these issues with the Japanese only come up against players that have really strong micro and really good ability to multitask and not panic under pressure. So for most players, this video will not be a very accurate representation of the Japanese, but in the higher levels of play, let's say 2000 elo and above, this is absolutely true about the Japanese, and this is a very accurate representation of how the Japanese play out in practice. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you guys did. And if you want more content from me, check out the Patreon for all my exclusive guides and content, and how to get to 2K yourself is through those guides. And if you guys want to watch my live streams, check out my Twitch. Links to both Patreon and Twitch in the description below. I'll see you guys there. Until next time, have a good rest of your day, and peace.